I've been asked to talk about myself, really, which is slightly humbling, slightly alarming, and a real privilege. So I'm going to share with you, I guess, my personal career journey, starting at the beginning, and then I'll take you to the present day and see how we go from there. So I wanted to give you my life in pictures. So I've got a few slides just to help me get going. But where it began. So I was born on the 6th of February 1964, 6 weeks early, and that tendency to be impatient, I think, has remained with me to this present day, and I'm pretty sure challenges and stresses out my own team on a regular basis. So I was born impatient, and I think that has been a figure of my career as I've gone along. So I'm northern. I've worked in Hertfordshire and London twice, and I've been up in Manchester now for 2 years, and I'm sure you can all tell by my accent that I am northern. When I was leaving London 2 years ago, one of my colleagues then said, "We can understand why you're going, Alison, because you really are northern, aren't you?" So I took that as a compliment. I'm very proud of my northern and working class. And what I've shown you there are pictures of my mum and dad. Oh, I don't know how to point this. Am I pointing the thing? No, didn't need to do that. I can't point. Young, my mother is 16 on the top picture to your right there, and my father is 19. I think that was their first holiday when they got engaged, followed by their wedding picture. And that's my mum and dad in 1983 when they bought their little bungalow that they were living in forever, and they wanted to be like the good life. Pictures of me as a child, big ears, they remain. Never did quite grow into them. And there's me. I think my dad had aspirations of being a photographer, and we spent lots of our childhood being dressed up in mother's knitted jumpers and posing for my father. Well, you can't see on that because I've had to crop it. We've got one which is our favourite, where we've got my dad with his feet showing and there are holes in his socks. But it was a great, happy childhood. And my work ethic, I like to think I've got a good work ethic, and it came from my parents. I wasn't the first of my family to go to university because my eldest sister beat me to it. But my mother had a number of jobs and was a ward clerk at Bolton General Hospital before she finished, and my dad was a joiner. And I miss him to this day. I need someone to build me an understair cupboard, but unfortunately my dad died 21 years ago, and I'm always saying, "Dad, you've never passed your skills down onto me, and I've known nobody to make me that cupboard." I'm sure he's trying to send me messages, but they're not coming through. So the early years, I left school. So born in 1964, I left Rivington and Blackrod School in 1980 to go to Runshaw College, but I left Rivington and Blackrod School, so 75 to 1980, with 5 O-levels, 3 CSCs, 1 in German. But for those of you that are old enough in the audience to remember O-levels and CSCs, I got a grade 3 CSC in German. I think I'd have been far better doing shorthand and typing, because that would have been more use to me in today's world than my ability to say Auf Wiedersehen very badly. I think I could probably still count to 1 to 5. But that score report there, I obviously had some potential and some early enthusiasm that seemed to wax and wane, and a tendency to talk too much. The tendency to talk too much remains. And when I went through those reports, because I'm a narrative researcher now, I would have loved if I'd have had the time to be able to actually tell my own story on narrative, but I think could reach her potential if she would stop talking and listen, was a perpetual plot line in my story. It was accidental that I ended up doing what I did in terms of my career after school, but it was my roots in hockey, netball, volleyball, running, and that's me obviously settled in the middle with the under-13s hockey team at Rivington and Blackrod School. We had a terrible year. We lost every single match, about 16-0. And I think we almost finished off our PE teacher. She left soon afterwards. I think we were just a little bit too much. We were enthusiastic and we tried hard. We just weren't very good. So I left school and went to Runshaw College, and I've had lots of failures over my career. When I was 16, I wanted to join the London Metropolitan Police Force because I wanted to be a detective. I'm so old that it was Dixon of Dock Green that actually probably got me wanting to be a police officer. In those days, you had to have certain physical characteristics in order to get there. And as a female, you had to be 5 foot 4 inches tall. I'm 5 foot 3.5 inches tall. I remember going to my local police station, so I sat the exam over in Chorley somewhere. I passed the exam, and then I had to go off to my local police station to be measured, because they wouldn't let me go down to London unless I'd been measured. So I arrived at Horwich Police Station as nervous as anything, saying, "Excuse me, Sergeant, do you think you could measure me, please?" Can you imagine doing this these days? So they measured me, and I was quite clearly 5 foot 3 and a bit. But they felt so sorry for me, because I think I probably burst into tears, that they actually said I was 5 foot 4. Unfortunately, when I went down to the London Cadet Training College, I did all the bleep tests, I managed all of those. I just couldn't quite stretch my neck long enough, and so that was the end of my police career. I'm still obsessed with crime novels, and I still love watching crime dramas on the TV. I'm pretty sure it's nothing like real policing, but nevertheless, I still have that affinity. So off I went to Runshaw College to do 3 A-levels, English, History and Sociology. Now, those of you that know anything about physiotherapy at all will realise they're not quite the right A-levels to do if you want to be a physiotherapist. And I'm often described these days, yes, but you're a scientist, in a kind of quantitative kind of sense. I'm so not a quantitative scientist. So off I went to Runshaw College, and those were the days when you did all your exams at the end of 2 years, and guess what? I didn't do any revision for about 18 months. And if you looked at those reports, that would say I talked too much as well, and if only I listened and applied myself, it would be okay. I managed to get myself a place to study English literature, which was my real love in those days, and that's when I get around to my research, I've perhaps ended up where I started. I love reading. I've always loved reading. My mother took me to the doctors when I was 5 years old because she thought I was deaf, because when I had my nose in a book, everything else kind of went away. So I thought the idea of sitting around and reading for 3 years was the best kind of university experience I could possibly have. I got rejected from Loughborough University because I couldn't remember any of the Keats poems when I was being asked very hard questions by the professor at Loughborough University. Luckily, the professor at Newcastle University was a bit more kind, and even when I couldn't remember the name of Macbeth, he kind of realised that I was probably a bit nervous, so it was kind of all right. I needed 3 Bs to go to Newcastle University to study English literature. When I did my mocks in the January of 1982, I got 3 Es. So it's like, heck, my mother was threatening me with employment, and I thought, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to work, so I need to find something that I can manage 2 A-levels, I think. I'll probably scrape sociology, and I ought to be able to do English literature, so I'll forget history altogether, and we'll see what we can do. So I sat in the library, no internet, no Google, no nothing. It was a very big book, and it started at A and finished in Z, so by the time I got to P, I was getting quite desperate, really. But going back to the hockey photograph, I was quite sporty. And I thought, physiotherapy, I have no idea what that is. I think it might be about broken legs. Now, if a physiotherapy applicant arrived at my university today and said, I think physiotherapy is all about broken legs, we would show them the door. But luckily for me, in the 1980s, I kept that to myself, and then I applied to go to physiotherapy. Thought, phew, you only need 2 A-levels, I can manage it. I wanted to go to London again. So I applied to all the London physiotherapy schools, and they were all full, because everybody else had applied and everywhere was full. But luckily for me, Manchester School of Physiotherapy took a reserve list. So off I went to Manchester on the bus, because at that point I don't think I'd ever been on a train on my own, so I wasn't quite sure how to do it. So I got the the number 126 bus, and I went to Manchester and was interviewed by a very scary Miss Waddington, Patricia Waddington, the principal of the Manchester School of Physiotherapy. And somehow or other, I managed to bluff my way through that interview. I stopped myself from vomiting when she started to mention sputum. I wasn't even sure what it was, but it sounded like a bodily fluid that I probably wasn't going to like very much. But I managed to convince her that I really did understand physiotherapy and I desperately wanted to be one. So she said, well, if you pass your A-levels, Miss Fairclough, you can come, and because someone else will fail. So luckily for me, I managed to scrape a C and a D. I was supposed to be, and I got my special paper in English. I was supposed to be really good at English. I was one of those top 10% in the 80s who got to sit special papers if you were slightly seen to have potential. So how I only managed a C in my English A-level, well, I do know because I didn't read the questions properly on the first paper, and by the time I got to the end of it and I was going over them at 10 minutes, I thought, oh dear, I've not answered the questions they've actually set to me. So I was really struggling. Anyway, so off I went to Manchester. It gives me great pleasure today to know that the Manchester School of Physiotherapy sits within the faculty that I am now leading and managing and running at Manchester Metropolitan University. So I really do feel as though I have come full circle, and it feels an incredible privilege. I have members of the physiotherapy team in Manchester, some of whom I did my training with, and some of whom were my students. In fact, a new member of staff came up to me yesterday and she said, I just wanted to introduce myself. And we chatted. She said, you taught me at Salford. I said, oh, did I? Because I didn't quite recognise her. It's quite a while since I worked at the University of Salford. She said, in actual fact, I found some of your notes the other day. I said, well, whatever you do, please don't show them to anybody, because they were written notes and on OHPs in those days too. So I did become a physiotherapist. I graduated or qualified in 1985, and I enjoyed a 10-year clinical career. So what you've got there are my buddies. We're in our... Stuart couldn't work out earlier whether it was a karate uniform, but it's not. It's a student physiotherapy uniform, and my badge says Miss Alison Fairclough, student physiotherapist. And these were all my buddies. And we had a 30-year reunion not so long ago, and I'd like to think that we all look the same as we did those, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and very excited. And the picture with us in dresses, we seem to be fond of ties in 1985, is our graduation. We had a pseudo-graduation because in those days it wasn't a degree, it was a diploma. So I enjoyed 10 years of a clinical career. I ended up as a neurophysiotherapist, and I think I ended up there because I've had a number of fantastic role models throughout my career, and my research now is into role modelling and identity. And Caroline Lofthouse was a senior 2 physiotherapist who was my supervisor and boss when I had my first job at the Lister Hospital in Stevenage. And I remember going on to the neuro rehab ward and standing in front of a patient, service user, and thinking, I have absolutely no idea what to do. I felt completely inadequate. I felt like my training had let me down, but luckily for me, Caroline was the most fabulous person. I was able to go to her and say, Caroline, I know I'm supposed to know what I'm doing, but I really don't. And from that moment, she took me under her wing and she helped me gain the confidence and the skills and the knowledge to end up choosing neurological rehab as my specialism. And I'll be forever grateful to Caroline for actually helping, because it was a very scary place to be. I felt very unprepared, and without Caroline, I doubt that I would have stuck with it, to be honest. But it's okay, it was okay with Caroline to say no. So I started at the Lister Hospital. I stayed for 10 months on my little forays down south, despite my 2 attempts in terms of police and physio never quite last. So, I just accept now I'm going to stay and I'm going to grow old in the north. I came back up to Salford and was lucky enough to get a job at what was Hope Hospital at the time. I then had a baby, the baby who's then on the snowboard now. And in those days, how ridiculous is this? In Hope Hospital as a physiotherapist, you couldn't work part-time. It was either full-time or not. So I had to move, I had to leave. So I went to the work at the Royal Bolton Hospital, and stayed there until I entered an academic career. But for me, throughout my career, my family, my parents, my sisters, and then my own family, when I got married and had children, remain at the centre of what I do. And whilst I am ambitious and I try to do my best, ultimately what I come back to is that family is more important. And I managed to juggle a career between having Daniel, who's at the top, who is 30 years old at the end of October, and William with Dougal the dog, who is now an actor and 23 years old. And that's my lovely husband at the bottom, Mr. Tony Chambers. And they are the people that keep me on track. They give me a hug when I've had a really bad day. They tell me to believe in myself when I'm racked with self-doubt. And they have lived through trying to get through my master's degree and ultimately through my doctorate, which I have to say, I used to think A-levels were the hardest thing to do. The jump from O-levels or GCSEs to A-levels, I always felt academically was one of the hardest jumps until I started my doctorate. So in 1995, I'd been a clinician for more or less 10 years, and we had lots of students on the unit where I worked. And I'd started to get the sense that I was actually looking forwards more to spending time with the students and supporting them to develop their knowledge and skills and love of physiotherapy, and particularly neuro rehab. And that was what was motivating me. So I knew at that point that it was probably not right for me to stay in a fully clinical role, because I'd like to think I have integrity, and I'd like to think that I know when it is time to move on to new things. It took me 4 interviews to get my first physiotherapy lecturing job, and indeed the person that got the job when I didn't at Manchester School of Physiotherapy has just retired from the Manchester School of Physiotherapy as a lecturer. I have forgiven her, sort of, but it took me 4 goes. I applied. I lived in Bolton. I had two small children at the time. Thought I could go and work in Bradford. My husband thought that's not going to work. Luckily, I didn't get that job. Anyway, I eventually arrived at the University of Salford. I stayed there for 10 years. Ended up managing physiotherapy and sport. Moved to UCLan, University of Central Lancashire, to set up a new programme of physiotherapy, and that expanded to include sports therapy, etc., etc. I then moved to Bucks-New University, main campus in High Wycombe. I was based in North West London. And then just over 2 years ago, I arrived back in Manchester to be working now as the Pro-Vice-Chancellor at Manchester Metropolitan University. That transition from clinician to academic, and I think if I'm really truthful, I still really consider myself a physiotherapist more than I do an academic. And I think this, that's kind of up to me really, isn't it? It's kind of up to me to self-define and define my own sense of self. But I still feel a bit of a fraud in higher education. I'm actually really a fraud as a physiotherapist. It's a long time since I was a clinician. But for me, physiotherapy, despite the fact that it was accidental that I ended up moving into that career, I have to say I've enjoyed every minute of it. There's been more highs than lows, and it's helped me get to where I want to be today. Those aspirations of that English degree were going to lead me to be a researcher on Panorama. I didn't want to be on the TV, but I wanted to be in the TV. So I probably wouldn't have been very good at that at all. So maybe, I don't know if it's choices or fate plays a part, but that's where I've ended up. I'm really fortunate. I love my job. I have the best job in the world. Day on, day out, I work with the brightest, the most committed bunch of academics than you'd ever care to meet. Their enthusiasm for their subject, their doggedly determination to improve things for people through their research shines through every day, and every day I am humbled in conversations that I have with them. They are amazing. In addition to that, I'm really fortunate that I'm in a role where I have some hand in the development and support of the new graduates of the future. I don't take that lightly. I take that role really seriously. But today I've left the Brooks building, which is where I work, which is teeming with bright-eyed, enthusiastic new undergraduates who are embarking on a range of degree programmes. It makes you feel like you're alive when you're with people who are enthusiastic and energetic about what it is they're doing. It also can make you feel quite old, because I don't think I'm old enough to be anybody's grandmother yet, but I'm definitely old enough to be their mothers. So, coming to me now. As a little girl, my mother thought I was deaf because I had my nose in a book. It was usually Enid Blyton, and The Magic Faraway Tree was by far and away the best book that I've ever read. It doesn't quite translate these days somehow. I tried reading it to my own children. I enjoyed it, they didn't. Anyway, so I've ended up as a narrative researcher. I get people to tell me stories about their lived experiences and take those stories and translate those into important, for me, cultural tools that can help future generations coming forwards. So my love of books and my love of stories, I think my wanting to spend 3 years sitting around reading, I have the privilege now of spending quite a lot of my time sitting around and reading and applying my love of stories into an academic endeavour. So I'm a qualitative researcher through and through. You'll never find a number in anything that I write because they're irrelevant. So I know you had a bit of a quantitative, qualitative thing going on. So who's a qualitative researcher in the room? Oh, there's a few of us. Okay, so you'll probably get where I'm coming from. I usually have lots of arguments with my quantitative colleagues who poo-poo stories and things like that. But as human beings, I truly believe that we are storied beings. We tell stories on a day-to-day basis that help us make sense of our experiences and who we are and what we are. And they are, for me, they are the most powerful way in which you can really, truly attempt to grasp the lived experience of each other, service users, other professionals, and people. It's something that we do naturally, and it is often less, and I think, well, let me start again. Stories, we tell stories for a purpose. So I'm telling you a story today that I've decided I want to tell you. It might not be a story you wanted to hear, but I have constructed my own story in a way that I'm comfortable with in order to share with you, and I hope gives you a sense of who I am. But we tell stories purposefully, and through stories you can often find ways of understanding that lived experience in very naturalistic ways. Nobody ever tells a story that hasn't got a point to it, or to use the posh term, a denouement. So we usually tell a story, there's usually a plot line, and there's usually a purpose to it. And as a narrative researcher, where I start is the ending of people's stories. So start with the purpose of the story and then work your way back. During my doctoral studies, I spent a long time understanding narrative research, and I focused on the construction of professional identities. I've chosen identities deliberately because in my mind there's no such thing. Identity is not fixed. It's something that moves and changes, and our identities change almost on a second-by-second basis as we negotiate around others what part of ourselves we are wanting to portray. In a professional context, that reciprocity between being and doing, in my mind, are very intricately related. And the things that you talk about in terms of your doing and enacting a professional role belie the underlying beliefs about you as a professional in terms of your identity, and your stories belie what is important to you. So through the use of stories, you can get to the real kind of minutiae and micro level of understanding lived experiences. For me, I'm very interested in understanding academic identities and professional identities, because I do believe, in the position that I'm in today, and certainly preparing the undergraduates and the graduates of the future, that these are really important things that we need to talk about, that I don't think we talk about sufficiently enough. And we unproblematise, and we think it's easy for people to become a social worker, become a physiotherapist, because we're not very good about talking about the complexities of identity and role. So I spend my time getting people to tell me stories. I just put my favourite book there, Therese by Francois Mauriac. I like quite depressing books. I don't know whether anybody's read that, but I quite like depressing books. And the reason that I've put The Last Tycoon up there, I've talked about Caroline Lofthouse, who was the physiotherapist who saved me, I think. She was just amazing. Everybody has a favourite teacher. Mine was Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts was my English teacher at Rivington and Blackroad School. And I was probably about the only person in the class that was remotely interested. But he lent me his books. So he lent me a copy of The Last Tycoon when we were studying it, and he must have had it at university, because there was lots of notes in the margins. So I looked really smart in class, because I didn't understand it at all, really, but clearly Mr. Roberts did. So when we were studying the book in class, I used to kind of parrot back all the notes he'd made when clearly he was at university. But I'd love to meet Mr. Roberts, because I think Mr. Roberts ignited in me an enthusiasm. He recognised in me that I was vaguely interested in literature and vaguely interested in words and books. And he actually helped me to kind of take that forward. So I'd love to be able to tell him that I think I've ended up as a narrative researcher because of Mr. Roberts. And so I'm thankful to him for seeing in me some kind of potential, because I was decidedly average. My narrative work I've talked about, and I'm really keen. I don't profess to understand him, but Foucault for me helps me to make sense of how power works and how people interact with others. And if you've ever read any Foucault, or you're ever interested in, I would encourage you to do that. When you read his work on power and power in organisations, it makes perfect sense, and you can recognise some of the things that we all experience on a day-to-day basis. And when I was doing my doctorate, it's been the hardest. It was so hard. It was intellectually hard. I did lots of crying. I did lots of stamping of feet. I did lots of slamming of doors. My husband had to take the children away for the weekends, otherwise I'd have probably killed them all. It was very hard. And again, I'm grateful to my husband for giving me the space to do that. And there was my husband was working away at the time, and I was way behind. I was running out of time. I can't do it. I'm too busy. It's too hard. I don't understand it. My supervisor says my writing's terrible. I just can't do it. My husband's really calm, and he's brilliant at kind of, let's just get perspective, Alison. And he was in the car, hands-free, by the way, so it was all legal. And I said, I can't do it, and I was crying. So he let me cry a bit, and then he said, look, Alison, he said, if I thought me saying, just forget it, don't do it, would make you feel better, I'd say that. He said, but you'll just feel worse. He said, so I'm sorry, but you're just going to have to do it. So I continued to say, yes, but I can't do it. So another 10 minutes of me crying down the phone. He said, right. I said, okay. The year previously, I limped the London Marathon. So once in a lifetime experience, I'll never do it again. And at 20 miles, doing all right till 20 miles, I have asthma. So I was really ill, I had a bad chest. Everybody said, we don't think you should run. People die running the London Marathon. I said, I'm doing it. I've also got a dodgy left knee. So at 20 miles, it'd still take me 4 hours, and I thought, I'm sure I can do another, I'll be all right. I felt fine-ish. I thought my chest is okay, I've got lots of Ventolin deposited by my person. That was the time that my left knee, I hadn't tested it over anything beyond 18 miles. At 20 miles, it gave up. I couldn't bend it and I couldn't straighten it. So I literally hopped, and I'm not exaggerating, whimpering, as usual. I'm such a crier. Whimpering the last 6 miles. And I don't know whether any of you have run a marathon, but for the ones that have taken a bit too long, they kind of start to sweep you up on a bus. So if you're taking too long, if the bus catches you, you've got to get on the bus. And all as I was doing is I was doing this, and the London Marathon was saying, I'm not getting on the bus. I'm just not getting on that bus. That's just going to be so embarrassing if I arrive at the end and I'm on a bus. I'm not doing it. So somehow or other, and I still to this day have no idea how I did it, but I did. And that day on that phone when I was saying, I can't do this doctorate, it's too hard, I'm not clever enough, he said, that London Marathon, you're at 20 miles. Whatever you found in yourself on that day last summer at 20 miles, you find it now. You find it now and you finish it. And when I was sat in my little cell or my spare bedroom that I'd removed all the furniture apart from a desk, I'd written a lovely plan about how I was going to do everything. I was already behind. And I'd sit there and I'd be going, right, you're at 20 miles, you're at 20 miles. And somehow or other, by focusing on me being at 20 miles and whatever it was that I found again, and I managed to get it done. But it was by far and away the hardest thing, but I could not have done it if my lovely husband had not had the wherewithal to kind of calm me down, remind me that I can actually do anything I want to do, really, if I set my mind to it. And going back to my working class roots, a little advice to my 18-year-old self is that, life has its own destiny for you and its own designs, and no matter actually how you try to plan for it, it's more like the bottom picture than the top. I've been sat on that boat in that water thinking, now what do I do? Lots and lots of times. But northern, working class, you pick yourself up, you dust yourself down and you get on. And I quite like looking at quotes on Twitter, and I can't remember the lady's name, which is a shame, but I say this to myself quite often and quite a lot recently. And she was a 97-year-old lady, and it was, you get up, you dress up, and you show up. So I have these little things in my head. So sometimes I'm saying you're at 20 miles, just keep going, and other times it's just get up, dress up, and show up, and it will kind of be all right. So I think at 18, I didn't know that. I know that now. I know that I can do anything I set my mind to it. It's not going to be easy, and I am going to fail lots and lots of times, but it's kind of okay. I really do believe, what doesn't kill you does make you stronger. Don't sweat the small stuff. Laura knows I sweat the small stuff still, but I try really hard not to. Try to keep things in perspective. And bad days always do end eventually. They do end. It's all right. Worry, that was another colleague of mine, Lord Professor Kamlesh Patel. Worry is wasted energy, Alison. Just don't worry about it. It doesn't make a difference anyway. So worrying about something doesn't make it go away. Lawns are overrated. As a working mother, 2 small children, I've worked full time. There's always the pressure of, cooking from scratch, having a perfect home, having a perfect garden. Our lawn was always this high. We were always the embarrassing house on the street where the front lawn was never quite right. I think just they're really overrated, so I don't have a lawn anymore because I haven't got the time to fit a lawn into my life. Fish fingers won't kill the kids. I tried to be Superwoman. I did make quiche from scratch, all my own pastry and fresh fruit and vegetables, but just occasionally I had to give my children baked beans, fish fingers and oven chips. But they kind of turned out okay. they're still alive and they're fairly healthy. So they won't kill them, so it's kind of all right. Don't sweat the small stuff. And going back to that picture of me as a baby, I never did quite grow into my ears and my nose, but it's kind of all right. And for me, dogs make perfect pets. So just finishing off now, I don't know where I'm going next. I'm 53. I've probably got another 13, 14 years of a full-time academic life. I'd love to be a Vice-Chancellor. Whether I ever make it or not, I don't know, but I'm going to keep trying to kind of get there. But I go back, really, I'm still that little girl with the white knee socks. Welcome to 1972. Height of fashion. I think we look quite rather dapper myself. But underneath, I'm still that little girl, that northern working class girl who had great sets of parents who just told us to do our best. It didn't matter what the end result was, just do your best and it will be all right. And that's what I do. I try. My test is, would my mum and dad be proud of me today? And if the answer's yes, it's kind of okay. The road, I hope, is long. I want to live till I'm about 97, if I can. So I'm kind of hoping that I've got a very long road ahead. And that's kind of me done. So whether you've pretended to listen or you have listened, thank you for pretending, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.